I do want to take the opportunity to thank and honor the original caretakers of this land. Hi, my name is Lisa Yates. I'm a tenured disability support counselor at Mount San Jacinto College in Southern California. For the last 4 years, I've been pursuing a PhD in higher educational leadership for changing populations, and I'm currently in the dissertation phase. Chapters 1 through 3 are approved, and I am ready to launch my study. I am motivated by the United Nations and World Health Organization's 21st century imperatives to governments, communities, and schools to improve the lives of individuals with disabilities around the world. Thank you for joining me to learn about the intersectionality of ableism and racism. I like to begin my presentations with music. And so I'm going to begin this one with the Negro National Anthem. I want to do this in part because I want to set a certain tone. I'm going to be discussing some difficult issues, and I would like for us to approach it with a similar frame of mind. But I also think we should sing it just because we can. We can sing it in any gathering, regardless of the audience, for the first time in my lifetime. And because we're facing hard times, both similar to and different from the issues present when the Johnson brothers wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. The day before I presented this workshop at the NCORE conference, Reverend Dr. Barber spoke about the Buffalo and Texas mass shootings. And I thought, I wonder when the next one will be, because I know there'll be a next one. And then I went to my room and I saw the news and I realized it happened again and at a hospital. I'm so weary. I feel like we're all just world weary. The Johnson brothers were weary too, and still they wrote about rejoicing because of the faith that grew out of their dark past. And they wrote about the hope of the present, even though their present world was still very much troubled. So I think it's a fitting song to open this presentation. And I don't think it should only be sung by African Americans. I think that we should invite our allies to sing it along with us, because we need the help of our allies, our accomplices, our co-conspirators in this fight. So I encourage you to sing along.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let us rejoice. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the to victory, is won.
I know that there's a lot of confusing language surrounding disability, special, differently abled, diversely abled, etc. So I'm going to throw another one out at you. My presentation is framed by a radical redefinition of disability proposed by disability scholar Tom Shakespeare, who identifies as disabled. Shakespeare describes disability as one of the many types of human predicaments that we encounter throughout life. A predicament is something that human beings may wish to avoid but can't escape. We all have those kinds of experiences where we're in a situation that we don't really want to be in, but we still have to manage. For example, I've had 4 children and it's all rosy after about the first trimester, but then right around that 9th month, I would start to remember what was ahead. That inevitable birthday was a situation I couldn't avoid and I had to get through. It was both a body and mind predicament. So when I use the phrase body-mind predicament, I'm referring to the challenges that individuals manage as a result of their disability within their environment. I agree with Shakespeare that body-mind predicaments are not just social constructs. The individual with the predicament has a real medical, psychological, physical, or cognitive condition to manage. However, the individual is further disabled by the environment due to social constructs surrounding their predicament. Challenging situations or predicaments are common to the lived experiences of every individual, and body-mind predicaments are just 2 types of countless human predicaments found in all cultures of the world, and predicaments occur along natural variations within the human diversity spectrum. Some body-mind predicaments are more commonly found in certain people groups, like people of color and diabetes, the elderly and arthritis, or football players and concussion disorder. And many of these predicaments increase the likelihood of depression. And within each predicament, there are fluctuating levels of severity that individuals have to manage. But as human predicaments, they are normal to the lived experiences of humankind, like divorce, job loss, or housing insecurity. So in a sense, our predicaments unite us as human beings. Certain types of human predicaments have firmly entrenched negative perceptions. Ableist views about human beings can be traced back to Plato's Republic, and since that time, Western culture has set apart body and mind challenges from other types of human predicaments, and they're enculturated through systemic isms. They're described in terms of deficits from a standardized norm and labeled as abnormal. Isms measure others against a standard that's presumed to represent a normal human being. But is it ever right to classify some as normal human beings and some as not normal humans? So for the next bit of time, I'm going to discuss ableism, racism, and how they intersect to further disable students with body-mind predicaments in education. As I share, I ask you to recontextualize disability as body-mind predicaments that occur along a diverse human spectrum of predicaments and not as damage. Higher education's ancestral origins include both ableism and racism because it was structured for a certain type of person that Goodley refers to as the species typical human. We know him, white, male, heterosexual, with privileged access to all he sees. Most of this nation's forefathers believed that because of their pigment, Negro Americans were cognitively impaired and needed the white race to control, make decisions, restrain, and breed them. It took several court cases to force higher education to increase access to more diverse groups because power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And time has shown us that equal access doesn't produce equitable outcomes. I serve on the DEI committee at an Hispanic serving institution, and although diversity's goals encourage an appreciation of difference, that's not enough. My college is determined to increase success outcomes for students of color, including equitable and inclusive strategies, because when students feel they belong in college, they succeed. But these goals present significant challenges, partly because ableism is infused into conceptions about race, and both intersect perfectly in higher education. These 2 isms reflect the predominant perceptions of people who have not experienced racial or ability discrimination and who fear the loss of power that change can bring. Isms make educators resist changing the way they teach, influence their definitions of normalcy, and cause them to distrust ethical care initiatives for historically disadvantaged students. My working theory is based on Carl Jung's collective unconsciousness theory and emerging research on genetic memory. I hypothesize that ableism and racism are transmitted not only through enculturation, but in the DNA and neural pathways of people whose ancestors bought and sold human beings because of their pigmentation. In her book, The Mark of Slavery, Jennifer Barkley writes that Blackness was tethered to disability and dependency based on the accepted notion that wholeness and normalcy are attached to ideas of whiteness. Within the enslaved community, medical neglect and abuse led enslaved African Americans to distrust white doctors. This shaped their experiences in negative and positive ways. Some enslaved Americans further marginalized individuals with body-mind predicaments, while others protected and hid them away from enslavers and valued them for what they could still contribute to their community. And yet, hiding them away also reinforced the notion that individuals with body-mind predicaments should not be seen. In Growing Up Down South, Shirley Abbott wrote, "We all grow up with the weight of history on us. The past, unanalyzed and undefined, hangs on Southern women as if they were dispossessed royalty, warping them for life." She also wrote, "Our ancestors dwell in the attics of our brains as they do in the spiraling chains of knowledge hidden in every cell of our bodies. I believe that the genetic memories of this nation's ableist and racist ancestors live on in the cells of its descendants and its institutional chains of knowledge. This nation's educational system has inherited ableist philosophies, policies, and practices from its ancestral institutions. For instance, ableism sired workhouses, ugly laws, and continues to criminalize and incarcerate people with body-mind predicaments. Ableism spawned eugenics and its grandchild genetics, along with instruments to measure intelligence through standardized testing, which created definitions of normalcy based on a dominant group. And ableism inseminated higher education. Hierarchically structured institutions with a history of excluding people perceived as less intelligent than the measured cultural norm are by definition ableist, though they may indeed be trying to become more inclusive. This nation's educational system has inherited racist philosophies, policies, and practices from its ancestral institutions as well. Racism gave birth to the institution of slavery, First Nation genocide, systemic national segregation and enforced poverty for people of color, eugenics and racialized sterilization, and racism built higher education. An institution structured and organized around a history of racism is by definition racist and exclusionary, even though it may be trying to become more diverse and equitable. African American and Black students are underrepresented in post-secondary disability support for many reasons, but two of them are poor institutional support to engage and communicate the services offered, and lack of access to the required documentation needed to access accommodations. This lack of support is reflected in the fact that African Americans with a history of body-mind predicaments have the lowest graduation rate of all other US racial groups. And representation matters, but unfortunately, when famous African American figures are covered in schools, those who managed body-mind predicaments while contributing to the nation seldom have their challenges mentioned in the telling of those contributions. And it matters because the employment rate for those with body-mind predicaments is significantly lower than the employment rate for those without, even when considering lower skilled jobs. And of course, when comparing Black Americans with and without body-mind predicaments, 40% of those with body-mind predicaments live in poverty compared to 22% of Blacks without. And all of this matters to success outcomes because, as disability and diversity advocate Atif Chowdhury pointed out, you can't hide skin color, but you can hide learning differences. And these issues are directly related to the intersectionality of body-mind predicaments and race. And the answer is higher education, a system built on foundations of ableism and racism. I'm a certified learning disability specialist, and so I was trained to assess for learning disabilities in community college by measuring intellectual ability and comparing that to academic achievement scores. I also worked as a student success counselor, helping students to develop learning strategies specific to different disciplines of study. So the way other educators know English literature or mathematics, I know learning. I know how people learn. And here's what I've learned from my students, that IQ, as it is currently measured, is only a small part of academic success. Learning efficiency related to processing speed, working memory, and how well students manage auditory and visual sensory input are more important indicators of learning college material than is IQ. Fitness trainers say that energy follows attention, and they mean that if you pay attention to your legs while you're biking, you'll energize them to pedal faster and stronger. The same is true for learning, but when the brain's attention is pulled away from learning, cognitive energy is decreased and learning becomes less efficient. To be clear, most body-mind predicaments do not impact learning because the student is less intelligent or has less capacity for learning. Rather, it's because the brain is distracted by symptoms, thoughts, and medications, and these impede their processing efficiencies like driving while texting. Contrary to the ableist core of higher education, principles of universally designed learning and assessment applied with ethics of care, like using inclusionary language, prioritizing learning over fixed time formats, and encouraging the use of in-class accommodations, help students to keep their attention focused on the subject matter so that sensory processes can be energized instead of overloaded and learning becomes more efficient. Unfortunately, ableist instructors resist those methodologies out of concern for academic rigor, and they create disabling learning environments. Here's a visual depiction of how body-mind predicaments impact learning. A brain that's managing symptoms like chronic physical pain, mental health flare-ups, dyslexia, ADHD, autism, or translating lecture into Braille or ASL has to manage the interference that those symptoms create. The interference affects attention, focus, and concentration, and these challenge both learning fluidity and connectivity to prior knowledge, so the student needs more time to process the incoming information. Along with the cognitive interference, the brain can become overwhelmed by the need to process large amounts of visual and/or auditory information in a short amount of time. And so this cognitive interference has to be supported in order to provide equitable opportunities for students with body-mind predicaments. Universally designed instruction, assessment, and learning, in-class accommodations, and other campus learning supports help to mediate that cognitive interference. Mental health predicaments were the fastest growing disability category in higher education before the pandemic. Now it's the fastest growing category in the nation. Tracing back to Plato's insistence that human reasoning ability justified having a ruling class with peasants and slaves to do the work, mind predicaments are more highly stigmatized than body predicaments. Here's what I've learned from serving students with mental health predicaments. In many cases, their predicaments are generational. Many have parents and grandparents who also manage depression, anxiety, PTSD, CTSD, and/or addiction. And some have siblings with autism spectrum challenges, learning disabilities, or ADHD. And often these come with anxiety and depression due to a history of being bullied or treated as other and less than. Mental health predicaments have to be managed while simultaneously processing information in college. And this can cause physical symptoms and increased stress. And then that creates performance and grade anxiety, which in turn heightens their symptoms. And this all intensifies anxiety and depression. And all of it becomes a cycle of cognitive interference. So students have to apply much more mental energy to do the same work as their peers without similar predicaments. Disability support departments offer a student-centered approach by providing accommodations and strategies, but we need to do more because while accommodations offer academic support, they're basically band-aids on a gaping ableist-inflicted wound. There's a lot more to unpack about ability, but I'm going to stop there and move on to ableism's partner in crime, racism. But first, I want to share a little bit about myself so you'll understand where I'm coming from with this. My maternal grandfather left his African home in Sierra Leone and stowed away on a ship to Liverpool, England. When they found him and learned he could cook, they gave him a job. But because of this picture, for a long time, I thought he was the captain of a ship, but I was also pretty sure that I was secretly an African princess. My grandfather married my white English grandmother, whose wealthy family disowned her for marrying a Black man. And my mother and her siblings were called pickaninnies in school and ridiculed because their mother didn't know what to do with their hair. My mother got pregnant and married an African-American GI, and they moved to Cleveland, Ohio, where she didn't know anyone except for his family. After he abandoned her with 3 small children, she worked 3 menial jobs, and his parents offered to help care for her daughters. But because their generosity didn't include their darker-skinned grandson, my mother declined their help. And sometimes my 6-year-old sister had to babysit us. And many nights we went to bed hungry because of their internalized racism. My mother remarried a hardworking widower with a daughter, and he had family in Michigan. So we moved to Detroit when I was 8 years old, just after the 1967 civil unrest that resulted in the United States Army occupying the city. For several years while I was in school, Detroit had the distinction of being the murder capital of the world. In Detroit, I was favored, privileged, underestimated, bullied, and victimized because of my light skin. And I was asked over and over again, "What are you?" Of course, I knew what they meant. And my reply was always, "I'm Black." But inside, I'd think, actually, I'm an African princess. I am a proud African-American woman who manages a permanent body predicament, and I know about the lived experiences of people who live with racial and disability oppression, enculturated and internalized racism, and the need to fight and die in order to obtain basic human rights. I know about a people whose intellect and creativity helped build this nation, even as their cognitive abilities were discounted and ignored. I know about a people whose lived experiences gave birth to the blues, whose passion and angst created jazz, and whose need to shake it off inspired rock and roll. As a native Californian, I admire the people whose sensuality and elegance produced salsa dancing, whose commitment to familia motivated them to make impossible sacrifices for a better life for their children. And I acknowledge the genocide and the cultural pride of this land's indigenous people. Racism punishes people of color simply for not being white, and it instinctively ignores our contributions while simultaneously appropriating our inventions, our mannerisms, and our rich cultural histories. We are all carriers of racism, and we are all still learning how deeply racism goes in America and how firmly entrenched the damage is, both externally and internally. And knowing all of that, while I was working on this presentation about racism, I caught myself in the midst of an internalized racist moment when I changed this to this. That moment of realization made me cry because it felt like a slap in the face to my grandfather. Because in my heart, I believe this, that we come from a people who, because they would not accept to be treated as subhuman, redeem the dignity of all people everywhere. A while back, I was trying to share my suspicion with a colleague that the generations of inhumane brutality, socioeconomic oppression, and systemic incarceration have resulted in neurological changes in African Americans, and that it's possible that our mental health is impacted to some degree because of it. My equity-minded friend said that she could never agree to what I was saying because it suggested that all African Americans are damaged. So I understand that what I'm going to share may sound like I'm saying my race is inherently damaged, but please remember that the framework for this is the understanding that predicaments only mean damage if we're comparing individuals against an ableist and racist view of normalcy. Remember that every human being experiences a variety of predicaments during their life, and that some predicaments are found more commonly in certain people groups, like people of color, and diabetes. Memories are transmitted through a culture's collective unconsciousness, and neuroscientists are researching the theory that memories can be passed on to form physical structures in the brain through DNA. Also, racism has been shown to have detrimental effects on the mental health of African Americans, and viewing racial violence is ubiquitous as we see it now in our living rooms and on our phones over and over again. And it's well documented that African American people have been inflicted with mental, physical, cognitive, and socioeconomic abuse by this country for 400 years, contributing to generational poverty. I believe this has created a spectrum of body and mind predicaments for us as a people group, like high blood pressure, chronic migraines, insomnia, stress-related cancers, CTSD, PTSD, ADHD, anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. We know that when this nation's colonizers formed their organizational systems and structures, they enculturated their views about racism, superiority, capability, and the subhuman treatment of people of color into those systems. And I believe that they genetically transmitted neural imprints of racism and ableism through survival of the fittest into their descendants. And the evidence is the continued irrational subhuman treatment of people who look the least like themselves. White stakeholders in primary, secondary, and post-secondary educational institutions see African American students first as Black. And because ability is attached to ideas of whiteness, Black students are perceived as less intelligent and capable than white students. I am also theorizing that mental health predicaments were beaten, humiliated, raped, and starved into my ancestors' bodies and minds, and the survivors of those traumas gave birth to people who, though no longer enslaved, were socioeconomically oppressed, physically violated, and constantly othered. My ancestors survived because of community support, sheer tenacity, and church. And some found a way out of extreme poverty through education and entrepreneurialism. And while survival fosters community identity, persistence, and grit, when those strengths can't be used to achieve the kind of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that we think of as the American dream for generations, what results is frustration, apathy, and despair. And I believe that those traumatic experiences were culturally and genetically imprinted into the minds and hearts of African American descendants, and generational stress and trauma were passed on. And when combined with systemic social inequities, they result in cyclical poverty, which creates more stress and trauma, so that frustration, disappointment, and anger become normalized within the brain's neural networks and must be overcome in order to focus and attend and choose to pursue higher levels of need, like earning a college degree. I believe that while African Americans have inherited strengths like intelligence and creativity, brilliance and spirituality, generosity and empathy, we're also constantly pushing through challenges like cognitive interference that makes us have to work harder and use more mental energy than that required of the species typical student for whom higher education was created. According to disability and diversity advocate Atif Chowdhury, if you ask a Black person, do you have a disability? The answer should always be yes, because structural racism disables us. The brains of individuals who received encouragement and support to achieve their dreams through access to quality education form neural pathways related to self-determination, success, and societal fitness. In contrast, the brains of individuals socially confined and restricted have to create coping methods to survive and form different neural pathways, because witnessing and experiencing abuse changes the brain. And so grit and determination develop alongside frustration and disappointment. The forefathers who built higher education for their descendants understood one way of learning, and their pedagogy created disabling learning environments for marginalized students, many of whom learn differently than the species typical student. Ableism and racism, Higher education's disabling structures condition Black students to give up on earning their degree, and the proof is in lower transfer and degree rates. Just a note, the pandemic revealed another disabling predicament. Colleges assumed that most students had access to technology because in the 21st century, most of the species typical students did. During the shutdown, African American students had to manage the symptoms of racism that were imposed by a brutal sequence of targeted and visually recorded police violence and frequent backlash against Black Lives Matter protests, while also needing to problem solve how to complete online tasks with a lack of technology, something that Black and Brown students had silently been managing by using on-campus equipment. Our colleges lost large percentages of African American students and students with body-mind predicaments as well, due to the disabling need for technological knowledge and access to equipments and the stress of dealing with ubiquitous racism. I am not saying that my race is damaged or that we should seek to escape our precarious American heritage. I'm also not saying that African American students can't rise above the inflicted predicaments. Clearly, we can and we do, as evidenced by those of us present at this NCORE conference. I'm saying that ableism and racism are body-mind predicaments and that we can't escape them. And that those of us who have achieved this level of academic success have used a lot more mental energy to get here than our white counterparts did because of the cognitive interference that ableism and racism create. I believe that higher education can lead the way in mitigating the symptoms of ableism and racism, but I don't think our educational system knows how to mediate that cognitive interference. And so one administrative solution after another has us spinning our wheels to increase success outcomes, but barely moving the needle forward. According to Dr. Ross Green, who produced the film The Kids We Lose, our educational system needs to problem solve with students in a proactive way to transform the culture and the mindset of education. And those of us in disability support programs can help because that's what we do. We collaborate with students in a proactive way, and we want to transform the culture and mindset of the college stakeholders who are stuck in that one-size-fits-all pedagogy. People often say that they appreciate the work we do in serving students with body-mind predicaments as if we're doing something special, but all we do is create a welcoming environment where students feel comfortable telling us about their challenges. That's the intake process. And then we figure out what they need so they can do their best work. That's the accommodations part. That's it. We welcome and listen to the students so that we can figure out what they need so they can do their best work. It's really not special. And isn't that what all educators should be doing? We know that education is the key to improving lives of individuals and families, and this is especially true for those who have been marginalized by ableism and racism. Individuals with body-mind predicaments who earn a college degree are employed at similar rates to those who earn a degree without similar challenges. But the unemployment rate for individuals with body-mind predicaments and no degree is double the unemployment rate for individuals with no degree and no body-mind challenges. I used to believe that disabilities had to be documented so that people wouldn't abuse the support that we provide. But then I was an interim veterans counselor for a year, and I learned about what happens to the bodies of veterans just from wearing the helmet and vest and backpacks and weapons that they carry on their bodies. Over time, the weight compresses their C-spine, which causes chronic pain later in life. Chronic pain impacts learning efficiency, so we stopped requiring extra documentation for veterans. To get disability support services at my college, all they have to do is show us their DD-214 because body-mind predicaments are recognized as resulting from military experiences. African American students are underrepresented in post-secondary disability support departments, which means that Black students with body-mind predicaments are not getting the academic support they need to succeed. There are a lot of reasons why they don't use our services, including distrust, documentation, and double stigma. We need to find a way to bring in African American and Black students who need disability disability support without making them feel further stigmatized. And we need to alleviate the complex onboarding process because support matters. Students with body-mind predicaments who utilize accommodations report greater college success because accommodations support that internal expenditure of extra mental energy, allowing them to do their best work. In a 2015 qualitative study of college students with body-mind predicaments, one participant said, "Everything just takes longer." And another student reported, "Without accommodations, I don't even want to think about where I'd be." My colleagues and I also have plenty of anecdotal evidence from our students that the support helps. Here's one of my favorites. This student participated in our annual Disability Awareness Month event called Beyond the Cover Living Books back in October 2020.
It's really just important to keep in mind that up until like maybe a couple years ago, I really didn't even think that a university was possible because of how much I've struggled, in my studies with MSJC. It's been an uphill battle. If I didn't have the accommodation service department, I think I would still be fighting that battle. So now I'm here, like standing really at the doors of a university, and I haven't really figured out what I wanted to do yet. Just the fact that I got here was absolutely amazing. I think it impacts my learning in every micro way, and it's always, it's like I said, it's the little things. I remember having to take face-to-face classes, and they were always very intimidating because in addition to having an anxiety disorder, I have a problem with my eyes. So I've always had to try to sit up front, but there are times where I couldn't get spots up front. So I always had to sit at the back. But because of my anxiety, it prevented me from asking, the professors if they could find a spot closer to, for me to sit at the front so I can see. I remember having to take exams, and the options of how I could talk to my professors, the accommodations hadn't been made known to me. So I had to take my exams with everybody else and just kind of suffer in silence because I have this disability that could hinder me from, giving my best abilities to perform on an exam. And it was extremely difficult to talk about it to my professor. And I didn't really know where to go to. Like I said, it wasn't until I met with Jason and then Lisa that they gave me my options. And they were like my lifeline because I was drowning, quite frankly. And there was a point where I actually considered leaving school. It has been debilitating on the most micro levels because the things that the average student takes for granted. Those are the little things that I think, makes a difference whether you would just want to drop your classes or just walk out, or just continue and try to see if you could find, a solution to get through with the semester. So to have a professor, reach out to you, or even another faculty member, counselor, reach out to you and say, "Hey, how's everything going? Do you need anything from us? What can we do to help?" It really does make the environment more welcoming and I think warming. It gives a student a supporting backbone. If we can start anywhere and start there, I think it really would make a difference. Having the disability, I think things could get unpredictable pretty quick. I'll just share this story with you guys really briefly. I was doing like night jogging. I try to get in a little bit of exercise to help with my, diabetes and anxiety. So exercising really helps to clear my mind. And so when I was running down the street, I saw a police officer, or it was a squad car hit an intersection of the street from where I was at. He must have saw me because when he turned going the opposite of where I was running to, like going kind of like the same direction. When he saw me, he turned around and he parked his squad car. Now he's facing directly opposite of me, and he saw me running. And I told myself, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, and nobody's out here. Clearly, he's looking at me, so I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. But that question in the back of my mind hit: what if he actually confronted me? What would I do? Because whatever I do, it wouldn't be perceived as me having some kind of disability. It would be more perceived as me as a threat and as being who I am. And there's just really nothing that I can do about that. So men of color that have a disability, I think it is a little bit more difficult for us because we already have that stigma of who we are in society. I think it kind of just adds a little bit more on top of that, where we have to think extra when we go outside. I know I do. So I have to constantly tell myself that everything's going to be okay. And when I have to tell myself that, that's when I know that I am still in survival mode. I have to try to reassure that everything's okay. Like I said, when I step outside of my house, no matter where I go, where I'm going to work, going to the store, I know there are people that are staring at me, especially when I go to the store. And then when I go to work and like I said, having the anxiety disorder already makes things just that much worse because we magnify the most smallest of things. So when I feel like I have to keep telling myself and reassuring myself it's okay, and I have to keep taking deep breaths, knowing that my heart is racing, I could tell that I'm in survival mode. And it's good every now and again to be in survival mode. But when you constantly live in a state like that, it takes a toll on you emotionally. So for me, it's like I try to escape it. But even now, as I speak to you guys, I constantly feel like I'm in survival mode. What I do, thankfully, because the school opened up the health center, I see a therapist once a week. So it really does help to alleviate a lot of the issues that I deal with throughout the week. Plus, exercising really does help me. I've had to do some diet modifications, but, between that and exercising, it really has helped to alleviate some of the anxiety. But, even with these modifications, some of these things can't eradicate the anxiety in total. So what you can't really, alleviate, you just kind of have to live with. And then I just mostly learned to live with it.
Can I just interject something too that we talked about in your intake, like living in flight or fight mode? The stress comes, the crisis comes, and you get into flight or fight mode, and then it comes down. But when you have constant anxiety and depression weighing on you, you kind of live in that fight or flight. And I remember when we were talking about your abstract, you were just going to call it out of survival mode. And then you emailed me later on and said, you know what? No, I want to change it to when does it end? And I think the reason is because you kind of live there, like you said, and that affects concentration and memory and cognitive processes that are important for college learning, right? So the fact that you've done all that while continually in flight or fight mode, and you're about to graduate and go to university, that's amazing. And you should feel really proud of yourself.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I appreciate that. So like I said, I can't tell you the level of support and the feeling that I have, with Jason. It's like I always have a friend when I'm on campus because I always know where to find him. So I just wanted to put that out there. And you too, Lisa, you too. So I just, like I said, thank you. I just want to say, thank you so much, Jason. Man, I wish I could hug you so bad right now. I wish I could freaking hug you. Like you guys are like so awesome, I swear. But since my last semester, so if I have any other issues or concerns, I'll definitely swing by. We're so proud of you.
We're always an email away.
So education is the answer, but we need to make access to support easier. If higher education is really interested in mitigating the intersection of ableism and racism, and higher education wants to improve outcomes for both students with body-mind predicaments and Black and Brown students, then these interests converge. Higher education has an opportunity to show this nation how a pluralistic community can come together to appreciate, support, value, and include diversity in all of its forms, including physical, mental, and cognitive and racial diversity. Disability support programs should work more closely with instructors to share what we know about learning and processing information and UDI, UDL, UDA, and the impact of trauma on learning efficiency. I'm proposing that accommodations should be assigned based on a collaborative process with African American students whose self-report alone indicates
cognitive interference, and I don't think they should have to prove a history of medically documented disability. We need to remove access barriers for Black and African American students in particular due to the historical and current body-mind predicaments that racism and ableism are. Because students with body-mind predicaments who use disability support not only succeed, they develop self-advocacy, self-determination, and they develop compensatory techniques that help them to utilize their strengths to support their weaknesses when they transfer to university. And we need to reframe disability from one of damage and less than to one of the many diverse predicaments that human beings manage, and connect ableism and racism to the other body-mind predicaments that cause cognitive interference in one-size-fits-all learning environments. We at NCORE know that racism is a problem, but we need to stop separating out racism from ableism, because ableism is infused into racism, and racism comes from ableism. We have to include ableism in our discussions about race and in our efforts to educate our colleagues about how these body-mind predicaments disable students of color. The country has equity fatigue, and we may think, let's just focus on racism for now, but too many Black and Brown students are doubly disproportionately impacted, doubly stigmatized, underestimated and excluded, misjudged and incarcerated. And a lot of them have body-mind predicaments, but we're not talking about ableism. While we work to discuss, confront, and disrupt ableist notions about race, we also need to support the extra mental energy that racism and ableism impose on students. How powerful a statement would it send if Black students began disclosing that they're using disability support to accommodate racism and ableism in higher education? Talk to your disability support departments and other special population departments to find out how they can use their expertise to help mediate the cognitive interference imposed by racism and ableism in higher education. Thank you.